The encrypted drive sat on the ranger station counter like it had crawled there on its own, and Evan said someone wanted us to see this. Mira leaned closer as the footage flickered alive, showing a cold trail twisting into the sealed valley. Jonah whispered. The last person who investigated this place never came back. Why bring it up now? Tessa froze the frame on a tall shape in the fog, its silver eyes reflecting the camera like it remembered who once filmed it. A chill moved through the room as Evan asked, why did this show up after all these years? And why did every camera in town shut off the night it appeared? No one answered, because the truth pressed against the edges of the footage, like something waiting to be found again. Evan said, this isn't just lost footage. It's an invitation. Mira watched the timestamp flicker across the screen, showing the moment Clara vanished years earlier, and whispered that the forest looked unchanged, like it had been waiting. Jonah leaned forward, shaking his head as he recognized the ridgeline. "Been shorty, at us." "The ridgeline," he said. "That place was sealed for a reason, and none of those reasons were natural." Tessa rewound the final seconds, revealing a trembling branch behind the camera operator, and said someone else was out there with them. The room grew colder as they realized the trail wasn't only retracing Clara's path, it was moving deeper than she ever reached. Evan spread the valley maps across the table, pointing to the sealed boundary line as he said they should verify whether the footage matched the terrain. Mira compared tree formations and whispered that the forest looked older now, heavier, as if something had settled into it since Clara vanished. Jonah refused to sit, pacing as he admitted the patrol logs from that month were wiped without explanation. Tessa traced the track marks in the video and noted they weren't human, yet not animal either. The four of them stood over the maps in silence, until Evan finally said the only thing that felt true. They had no choice but to go back. Jonah opened an old ranger locker and pulled out a sealed evidence pouch marked with Clara's name. Inside lay her final radio, scratched and dented. Evan said they should power it on. But Jonah warned that it hadn't made a sound since the night she disappeared. Mira held her breath as the radio clicked alive, releasing only a faint, broken hum, like something breathing through static. Tessa adjusted the dial slightly, and for a moment, a single knocking sound echoed through the frequency, slow, deliberate, too rhythmic for wildlife. They all stepped back, realizing the forest wasn't silent when Clara vanished. It was listening. Evan gathered the recording gear while Mira packed sample kits and Tessa checked drone batteries. Jonah stood at the door, staring out at the dark trail beyond the station, and said he felt the valley remembering them. Tessa tried to joke, but the fear in her voice told the truth. Mira stepped beside Jonah, saying they needed answers for Clara and for whoever shot the new footage. Evan locked the drive into a case and said they'd enter the valley at first light. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like something brushing past, eager for their return. The forest swallowed the road long before the sun reached it, and Evan said the air felt heavier than he remembered. Mira walked beside him, brushing her hand over ferns, slick with cold dew, as she whispered that nothing moved. Not even the birds. Jonah led the way to the barricade he once patrolled, its metal frame bent inward as if something tall had stepped through. Tessa filmed the crushed boundary sign and said, "This wasn't weather." A distant thud echoed across the ridge, too slow to be footsteps and too deep to be a falling branch. Evan looked back at the van sitting alone on the abandoned dirt road and said they'd crossed the point where Clara's last signal went dead. They pushed deeper into the valley, following the faint trail left in the old footage, and Tessa said the temperature kept dropping even though the sun was rising. Jonah paused at a set of deep impressions in the mud and whispered, "They weren't here last season." Mira knelt, comparing each mark to the prints in Clara's archived notes, and said they were the same size but stretched unnaturally long. Evan recorded everything, trying to steady his breathing as the trees leaned inward like they were closing ranks. A soft clicking sound drifted from the brush, and the group froze. Tessa whispered that it wasn't an animal call. It was too steady, too measured, as if it were counting them. By midday, the valley darkened under a thick ceiling of clouds, and Mira said the forest silence felt wrong, like sound itself was being held back. Jonah guided them toward an abandoned outpost he remembered, its roof consumed by moss. Evan stepped inside first, revealing shelves collapsed under years of moisture and a cracked radio mounted on the wall. Tessa wiped dust from a desk and found old ranger notes scattered across the floor, each page warped by water. Mira picked up a torn map marked with a circle around the ravine where Clara vanished. She whispered that the circle wasn't drawn by Clara. The ink was older, faded into the paper as if it had been there long before she arrived. Jonah stepped outside to check the perimeter and called the others over to a set of claw marks running down the outpost's support beam. Evan measured the grooves with his hand and said the creature in the footage had fingers long enough to make them. Mira found a second set higher up, angled as though something had steadied itself against the wall while watching inside. Tessa lifted her camera, but the screen flickered with static that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Jonah said the markings weren't fresh, yet they hadn't been there when he last patrolled. Evan felt a tremor in the beam under his palm, as if something deep inside the wood shifted when he touched it. They continued toward the ravine, following the coordinates left in Clara's last message. The deeper they walked, the more the forest began to change shape. Trees twisted inward, their trunks narrowing like ribs forming a corridor. Mira said the plants were bending toward a single direction, as if responding to something moving ahead of them. Jonah kept glancing behind, insisting he felt footsteps that never made a sound. Tessa checked her audio recorder and found its meter rising even in complete silence. Evan stopped at the top of the ridge, staring down into a valley drenched in thick white fog, and said the trail ended here for Clara. But something waited where the fog began. The fog clung to their clothes as they climbed down into the ravine, and Evan said the air felt like a different season entirely. Mira scanned the ground and whispered that the moss was flattened in a straight line, as if someone had dragged equipment through recently. Jonah pointed to a snapped branch high above them, saying Clara was shorter than that reach, which meant something else passed through. Tessa lifted her camera and froze when she noticed a faint beam of light flicker deeper in the fog, too slow and too steady to be sunlight. Evan said they'd follow the trail exactly as Clara did, but quietly added that he feared they weren't the only ones doing so. They reached a narrow bend where the forest canopy collapsed inward, and Mira said she recognized the rock formation from Clara's final photograph. Evan traced the edge of the boulder, finding the same scratch Clara circled in her notes. Jonah stepped closer and muttered that the mark wasn't natural. It followed a pattern almost like writing. Tessa compared the footage frame to the stone and gasped when she realized the scratch was deeper now, as if something kept carving it over the years. Evan felt a cold pulse through the rock, and for a moment he thought he heard breathing echo from inside it. A faint metallic rattle drew them toward a half-buried trail camera, wedged between roots. Tessa pulled it free, brushing off dirt as she said it wasn't one of theirs and wasn't Clara's either. Jonah recognized the model and whispered it was from a surveillance batch never released to field teams. Evan powered it on, and the tiny screen burst with static before showing a single frame of Clara's silhouette standing in this exact clearing. Mira covered her mouth, saying the timestamp was from the night she vanished, but the angle was wrong. Clara had never carried a camera that high. Someone else recorded her last moments without her knowing. A hollow wind swept through the clearing, carrying the faint scent of metal, and Mira said it reminded her of old batteries left in the rain. Evan reviewed the recovered frame repeatedly, noticing a thin shadow beside Clara, too narrow for a human and too tall for her to miss. Jonah circled the perimeter, finding faint drag marks leading away from the clearing, and said they weren't signs of struggle but guidance, like something escorted Clara deeper. Tessa lifted her audio recorder as a soft clicking returned, steadier and closer now. Evan whispered that the clicking wasn't a call or a warning. It was an answer. They followed the drag marks until the forest opened to a narrow wooden bridge, rotting over a chasm. Mira said Clara mentioned this bridge only once, noting she heard something breathing beneath it. Jonah tested a board and stepped back when it creaked under a weight that wasn't his. Tessa pointed her camera down into the darkness and saw nothing, just endless black, as if the earth had never finished forming below. Evan said Clara crossed this bridge shortly before her final message, and that meant they would too. But as he stepped onto the first plank, something shifted in the dark below, responding as though it recognized the sound of his footsteps. Mist rolled across the bridge as Evan led them to the opposite side, and Mira said the air felt charged, like static before a storm. Jonah lifted his flashlight and froze when the beam hit a hollow between trees where the fog refused to move. Tessa whispered that her audio recorder was pulsing even though there was no sound at all. Evan stepped forward and felt the ground tremble slightly, as if something beneath the soil shifted in response. Mira pointed to a thin trail of disturbed leaves, weaving deeper into the dark woods, and said Clara followed that same path. A soft clicking echoed behind them, faint but unmistakably close, and they realized the sentinel was no longer ahead. It was already here. They moved carefully into the woods, following the faint track that looped between towering trunks. Jonah whispered for everyone to stay close as he noticed fresh impressions in the soil. Long, narrow, each spaced as if whatever left them walked without sound. Mira studied a broken branch overhead and said it bent recently, still dripping moisture from the fracture. Tessa lifted her camera as the clicking sound repeated, this time stretched into a long, slow rhythm that made her breath hitch. Evan said the sound wasn't random. It felt like it matched their steps. The forest responded again, the air humming as if holding its breath. A sudden metallic ring echoed through the trees, sharp enough to make them flinch. Evan hurried toward the sound and found an old campsite crushed under fallen branches. Mira lifted a torn scrap of backpack fabric and whispered that it matched Clara's. Jonah followed a trail of indentations beside the debris, each one widening as if something heavy approached before stopping abruptly. Tessa scanned the tree line, catching a flicker of movement, a tall silhouette retreating behind a cedar in one smooth step. Evan whispered that the sentinel wasn't fleeing. It was waiting for them to follow. They pushed on until the forest dropped into a narrow basin cloaked in thicker fog. Tessa stiffened when her camera flickered, the battery draining faster than it should. Evan said they should document what they could before everything shut down. Mira noticed a cluster of stones arranged in a spiral near a fallen log, each one etched with the same marking found on Clara's boulder. Jonah whispered that none of this matched the geology reports from his old patrol. Then a long exhale drifted from the fog, deep, steady, not human. The sound pressed against their chests like a held breath, shared by something watching. Watch. The clicking returned, clearer now and coming from directly ahead. Evan whispered for lights low as they stepped toward an open clearing rimmed by fractured roots. Mira gasped when two silver eyes surfaced from the fog, not glowing but reflecting their movements like polished mirrors. Jonah raised his hand instinctively, telling everyone not to run. Tessa's camera shook as the tall figure emerged halfway, gaunt limbs, elongated posture, shoulders rising and falling slowly as if it recognized their faces. Evan whispered the question he feared most. What if it remembered Clara? And what if it expected them next? The sentinel vanished back into the fog as quickly as it appeared, leaving the clearing colder than before. Evan said they should follow slowly, but Jonah insisted the creature wasn't guiding them toward escape. Mira examined the spiral of stones again and whispered that each carving matched symbols found on Clara's old notes, ones she couldn't translate. Tessa replayed the last seconds of her footage and noticed the creature never blinked, only shifted its head as though listening to something deeper underground. Evan said the valley wasn't reacting to the creature at all. It was reacting to them. A distant rumble rolled beneath their feet, rising like something waking under the soil. They followed the rumble toward a narrow channel where the trees thinned, revealing a shallow trench lined with collapsed roots. Jonah said the trench didn't exist during his last patrol. and the exposed soil looked freshly torn. Mira crouched beside a strange impression embedded in the dirt, a wide circular shape with a pattern resembling the markings on the stones. Tessa recorded as the ground gave a soft, hollow echo beneath Mira's hand. Evan whispered they were standing on a chamber, not solid earth. The clicking sound returned, but this time it came from below them, rising through the soil like a warning or a plea. The trail led them to an abandoned logging lift tower, standing crooked above a nearby slope. Jonah said the tower was decommissioned years before Clara arrived, yet the ground beneath it showed fresh disturbances. Mira found a strip of torn fabric tangled in a bolt, Clara's color, Clara's pattern. Evan steadied the camera as they climbed the hill, each step vibrating from a deeper tremor rising through the valley. Tessa pointed out that the forest felt like it was drawing energy from somewhere below. Jonah said if something was buried there, Clara might have discovered it first. Evan whispered the truth settling over him like cold air. The sentinel wasn't guarding the valley. It was guarding what lay hidden under it. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a metallic scent that made Mira shiver. Jonah spotted a narrow fissure in the hillside where soil had collapsed inward, revealing a cavern lit by faint blue luminescence. Evan said. The light matched what flickered in Clara's final still image. Tessa lowered a mic into the fissure and recoiled when a deep, slow pulse vibrated through her headphones. Mira whispered that the frequency wasn't random. It repeated in exact intervals. Jonah said it felt like a heartbeat, but too slow and too strong to belong to any living creature he knew. Evan stared into the cavern's glow and said the valley wasn't hiding a monster. It was hiding something older. The ground shuddered again, stronger this time, forcing them back from the fissure. Tessa's equipment crackled with static as a distorted echo surged upward, shaping the clicking rhythm that I'd heard since entering the valley. Mira clutched her pack and whispered that the sentinel wasn't calling to them. It was answering whatever stirred below. Jonah said Clara must have reached this place and understood too late what she'd uncovered. Evan looked toward the darkening forest, realizing the creature had been guiding them here not to harm them, but to warn them what would happen if the valley opened again. The tremor deepened, shaking the trees as though something beneath the earth pushed upward for the first time in years. The tremors faded into a low hum under the soil as the forest shifted around them, branches trembling even without wind. Evan said they needed higher ground before the valley changed again. Mira pointed toward a ridge where the trees bent outward, forming a narrow path that hadn't been there moments before. Jonah warned that the valley didn't make paths unless something wanted them to follow. Tessa checked her recorder and saw the audio levels spike wildly, even in complete silence. As they started forward, a distant roar rose from the fissure behind them, deep enough to shake the air. Evan whispered that whatever was waking beneath the valley was no longer contained, and they had minutes before the land moved again. They followed the ridge until the forest thinned into a narrow corridor where the air grew painfully cold. Tessa's breath shook as she whispered that something was moving behind them. Jonah swung his flashlight back, the beam cutting through fog to reveal nothing but drifting mist. Mira stepped closer to Evan and said, the clicking they'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by a distant scraping far below the earth. Evan tightened his grip on the camera, saying Clara must have reached this point before disappearing. A sudden metallic clang echoed from the trees, sharp enough to make them flinch. Jonah whispered that they weren't hearing the sentinel anymore. They were hearing something bigger. A distant shape appeared through the fog, tall, unmoving, waiting. Tessa lifted her camera nervously, and the figure shifted one step forward, silent as falling ash. Evan whispered that it was the sentinel, and Jonah warned everyone not to run. Mira stepped closer, noticing the creature's posture different now. Lower, almost protective. The sentinel tilted its head, the silver reflections in its eyes flickering as if reacting to the tremors beneath them. Evan said it wasn't blocking their path. It was guarding them from what was coming next. The ground rumbled again, deeper this time, and the creature flinched as though bracing against a force they couldn't see. The next quake hit violently, knocking Mira to her knees as soil split open across the clearing. Jonah grabbed her, pulling her back, just before the ground collapsed into a long, jagged crack. Tessa leaned too close to the edge while trying to capture the footage and slipped as the earth gave way beneath her. Evan lunged forward, catching her backpack strap, but the momentum dragged both of them toward the opening. The Sentinel moved faster than any of them, stepping forward with impossible speed and anchoring itself against a tree root as it pulled them back from the collapse. Jonah stared in disbelief, whispering that the creature didn't save Clara. But it saved them. The tremors eased, leaving the forest in a strained, unnatural silence. Tessa trembled as she whispered that the Sentinel wasn't trying to hunt them. It was trying to keep them from going further. Jonah, said Clara, must have ignored its warnings until she reached whatever was buried beneath the valley. Mira looked toward the opening fissure, glowing faintly with blue light, and said, "The valley wasn't awakening by accident. It was responding to something they triggered by entering." Evan stepped toward the Sentinel, asking quietly what it wanted them to do, but the creature only bowed its head as if mourning. Behind them, the forest shifted again. Someone was missing. The group turned and realized the valley had taken Jonah. Jonah's absence hit them like a blow, and Mira called his name until her voice cracked. But the fog swallowed every sound. Evan gripped his camera and said they needed to retrace the last spot they saw him, though fear twisted every word. Tessa whispered that the valley didn't take him randomly. It reacted the moment the fissure widened. The Sentinel stood motionless, its posture lowered, silver eyes angled as if urging them to leave. Mira pointed to a trail of disturbed soil leading away from the clearing, thin and straight, like someone being guided rather than dragged. Evan said they had no choice but to follow, because whatever took Jonah might be the same force that pulled Clara into the dark years ago. They followed the narrow disturbance through a corridor of leaning cedars until the trail ended abruptly at a cluster of stones identical to the patterns Clara once documented. Tessa knelt beside them, saying the markings formed a path rather than a warning. Mira checked her notes and whispered that Clara believed the symbols guided something older than the Sentinel. Evan scanned the area and found a single scrap of fabric snagged on a branch. Jonah's, stained with soil but not torn. Tessa lifted her camera, and the screen flickered to reveal a faint silhouette far down the path, tall and unmoving. Evan whispered that it wasn't Jonah. It was waiting for them to continue. The trail opened onto a sunken hollow lined with spirals carved into the earth itself, each one pulsing with a faint blue glow rising from below. Mira whispered that Clara must have reached this exact place, and the valley had changed ever since. Evan stepped forward and saw a camera half buried in the soil. Clara's model. Tessa retrieved it carefully, brushing away dirt until the cracked screen flickered to life, showing final recorded frame. Clara staring upward in terror at something above her. Jonah's voice echoed suddenly from the hollow, faint and strained, calling for help from somewhere beneath the glowing soil. The valley answered with a deep rumble that curled through their chests. The hollow trembled and split, revealing a chamber beneath them filled with swirling blue light. Tessa leaned forward, spotting Jonah lying near the chamber's edge, breathing but unmoving. Evan shouted his name, but a surge of wind rose from below, pulling at their clothes like unseen hands. Mira reached for Jonah only for the ground to crack wider, forcing her back. The Sentinel descended the slope in one deliberate movement, placing itself between the group and the widening chamber. Tessa realized the creature wasn't protecting the valley from them. It was protecting them from whatever had taken hold beneath the earth. Evan whispered that this was the real secret Clara uncovered, the one she never escaped. The chamber roared with a rising pulse, and Evan shouted that they had seconds before the ground collapsed entirely. Mira grabbed Tessa, pulling her up the slope, while Evan reached for Jonah again. The Sentinel stepped forward, lifting Jonah effortlessly with one long arm before placing him into Evan's grasp. The ground buckled behind them as they scrambled out of the hollow. A final echo rose from the chamber, Clara's voice captured in distortion, repeating a single trembling phrase. "Don't follow it." The glow vanished in an instant as the chamber sealed itself, leaving only silent fog. Evan recorded the last image of the sentinel standing at the edge, watching them go, as if ensuring the valley closed for good.